Hello, hello again to another Agakala Reacts, and today we're watching another part of World War II Part X, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising from the Royal Casa Grande from the Elsin School. And we are at hour mark, and the previous part you can watch uploaded 2 weeks ago. I will have playlist ready, so you can find it here or here, wherever. So yeah, let's just jump into it and just see what else we have to say. He have to say about thing. Like in the last part I've seen that actually I learned something new about that, because there was two different Jewish underground organizations, and I knew about one but I never heard about the other one. So yeah, I'm learning something new as well about that. So let's just go.
So the ZZW does end up with a little bit better armed, a little bit better off than the ZOB, but honestly both forces were severely underarmed. Like, they did not have enough rifles, they did not have submachine guns, they had a very few hand grenades, some of them had Molotov cocktails. Like, this is not a well-armed force. The thinking that they're having is, as they fight and they die, the soldiers behind them will run up and grab whatever weapons they had, and if they get lucky and kill Germans, they'll take the weaponry and ammunition from those Germans, and that's how they'll arm themselves as they fight. The commander, the German commander of the Warsaw Ghetto, is ordered to go ahead and start the operations again in January to clean out the rest of the ghetto. They arrive on January 18, 1943. They are SS, so I guess I should explain SS for a second, because the Schutzstaffel is kind of a weird organization. When we start doing it in the United States, you'll remember this conversation. You'll be like, oh crap, we shouldn't do this, should we? Every once in a while, you see a state do it somewhere on the planet, and you're like, I wish you wouldn't do this. The SS and the SA were paramilitary organizations that the Nazi political party created that were not part of the army. So the army was the Heer, H-E-E-R, Heer. The SS were not part of the Heer. They were not army. They were their own private military force. Once the Nazis took over Germany, Hitler and his goons decided that they didn't trust the SA, Schutzabteilung? Yeah, Schutzabteilung. So they did the Night of the Long Knives, where they actually went in and murdered them at night. So one of the paramilitary forces took out the other paramilitary force. The paramilitary force that did the taking out was the SS, Schutzstaffel. They were originally Hitler's personal bodyguard, so he trusted them more than the Schutzabteilung, because he saw them as closer to him. So that's why he makes the choice to kill the members of the SA, just to clean up, just to make sure there's nothing coming down the pike. One of the things that the Nazis were really good at was killing each other. They were just, this was like a thing. When you think about it, it's just Darwinism, right? The smartest and backstabbiest will rise slowly to the top. It's a great political system. Who came up with this? Ooh, can I be a part? Anyway, so you're constantly looking over your shoulder. In any case, the SS then morphs into two basic organizations. There's Waffen-SS, and then the guys who are going to be in charge of the concentration camps. And then later, once they start doing the death camps, the guys that are going to be in charge of the death camps. Now, they're the same organization, it's just they have two wings. So the Waffen-SS is a combat force. Leibstandarte is the first of those divisions. They actually made SS divisions. Leibstandarte is the first. I don't remember all their names. Number 5 is Viking, as in Vikings. And they would take these, they would make these military units. They were one of the things that you want if you have a good soldier. You want them to be fanatics. You want them to be crazy, because crazy people are willing to die. They can't wait to die. They know that dying is the path to salvation. And the SS were capable of this, so they were really good soldiers. They were also great at war crimes, because they saw their adversaries, especially when they were fighting the Russians, as subhuman. So for them, killing them in a horrible way, shooting prisoners, just wasn't a thing any more than killing a cockroach, because they had so dehumanized the other side. They saw the other side as cockroaches, vermin that needed killing, animals that needed killing. They're just terrible, horrible creatures. And the world was better off when you killed them. At the end of World War II, there were 7 million dead Germans, 10% of the population. There were 28 million dead Russians. It was 1/7 of the population. Like, the Nazis showed the Soviet Union the stars in the day, and it wasn't because they were looking at the US flag. It was a disaster on an epic scale. 65 million people dead, 28 million of them were Russians. And that was because the Nazis just believed Russians were subhuman who needed killing. That's what drove them to this. So what the Nazis did then is they created a military structure.
But isn't it though that the Russian died not only from the hands of Nazis, but as well because Stalin was such a fanatic himself that he just pushed them too much, and a lot of them just died of starvation, or when there was a don't remember what that part of the war was called, but basically when the Nazis were going to occupy Russia, to go towards Moscow and stuff, and they decided to go in wintertime. The Russians were just so, not that they were unprepared, but they just didn't have enough supplies, and they were dying there from starvation, from frost and stuff like that.
Where there was the Wehrmacht, and inside the Wehrmacht were the SS and the Heer.
I'm just gonna look into that because I'm kind of curious about it, because this is what I hear. But the thing is that being Polish, I'm biased. Terribly biased in regards of either Russians and Nazis. So, how many Russians died from Nazis' hands? There's a Holocaust encyclopedia, but that's about POWs, that's prisoners of war, isn't it? Nazi extermination of Russians POWs. And German policy towards Soviet prisoners of war during World War II was driven by Nazi ideology, which defined Russian, Soviet, and Slavic people as undermentioned, useless subhumans, the same category that included Jews and Roma. The fate of the Russian POWs was sealed. Laws about prisoners. The Soviet Union hadn't ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, nor had it committed to the 1907 Hague Convention of the Rules of War. This meant that technically both the Soviet Union and Germany were only obligated to the customary international laws of war of that time. But even the customary laws provide for the protection of prisoners of war. Invasion of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were allies in the war against Poland that had begun on September 1st, 1939. Then, without warning, on June 22nd, 1941, German troops attacked the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. There you go, yeah. The Nazis used several brutal tactics. Prisoners were starved to death, given only about 700 calories as a daily ration. Reports from late 1941 document that prisoners ate grass and leaves in futile efforts to survive. The prisoners were given no real shelter. They dug trenches. They granted protection from the elements, but epidemics of typhoid and dysentery killed at least 5,000 people a day. Is there a number? No, it doesn't though. By the end of the war, as many as 3.5 million Russian prisoners were dead, a number exceeded only by the 6 million Jews who were murdered. prisoners of war must be protected. Okay, this is one thing. Let's see. How many Russians died because of during World War II because of Stalin. Okay, so I found here there's an article from France 24. I call it 24. I know it's not really that, but is the title of the article says Stalin pushes added to vast human cost of World War II. So basically, the Soviet Union suffered the greatest losses of any country as it fought the Nazis in World War II. At the same time, Joseph Stalin's regime attacked its own citizens, executing, incarcerating, and exiling those it viewed as hostile. Here are some of the most striking statistics. Tripling. So in 1946, Stalin said 7 million had died in the 1941-45 Great Patriotic War, as the conflict is known in Russia. That's the first time I hear about it too. Stalin gave a massively understated figure that gained him kudos as a brilliant military strategist and heightened his cult of personality. After Stalin's death in 1953, his successor Nikita Khrushchev dismantled the personality cult and almost tripled the death figure to 20 million, blaming such huge losses on Stalin's incompetence. The last Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev opened up state archive for the first time, and historians came up with a new, even higher figure of 26.6 million deaths, 12 million among the military and 14.6 million among civilians. One of the largest tolls came during the siege of Leningrad from 1941 to 1942, when up to 1 million inhabitants of the city, that is now St. Petersburg, died lacking food and fuel in winter as they were encircled by Nazis. The deadliest military engagement, the 1942-43 Battle of Stalingrad, saw more than 1 million Soviet troops killed, but proved a turning point in the war. The Stalin's samovars. After the war, the cruel nickname for the many soldiers who had lost all 4 limbs was Stalin's samovars, based on the shape of the traditional water heaters for tea. Oh wow, awful. The conflict left some 2.5 million people with lifelong disabilities. Hundreds of thousands had no one to care for them and were reduced to begging, fueling their resentment against the state. In 1948, the state began organizing their removal from the public eye, putting them in former monasteries converted into sanatoriums in remote northern regions. Great winters there, huh? Those institutions went on to incarcerate others on the margins, such as beggars or people with serious disabilities, whom Soviet officials wanted to hide from view. Some of the institutions stayed open into the 1970s. Executed for defeatism, more than 2.53 million Soviet citizens were convicted by military tribunals, including 1.43 million deserters and draft dodgers. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 175,000 people were executed for espionage, treason, desertion, or defeatism. About 80 million in the USSR and in the Baltic states that had been forcibly incorporated into it found themselves living under Nazi occupation. A total of 1.24 million of these served in the German army, including 400,000 Russians, 250,000 Ukrainians, 150,000 Latvians, 90,000 Estonians, and 70,000 Belarusians, said historian Viktor Gavrilov, a researcher at the Military Academy of the Russian General Staff. Punishing people. Okay, so all those people were executed, huh? Okay, so punishing peoples. From 1941 to 1942, Stalin decided to uproot minority ethnic groups he suspected of being potential collaborators from their long-standing homelands. He started with the entire German community in Russia that had settled mainly around the river Volga and numbered more than 800,000. They were taken by train in cattle cars to Kazakhstan. Then it was the turn of the Greeks, the Finns, and others. From 1943 to 1944, as the Soviets pushed back the German army, Stalin began forcibly removing dozens of other ethnic groups, among them Chechens, Ingush, and Crimean Tatars, and sending them to live in the inhospitable steppes of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Siberia. Altogether, some 1.2 million people were moved to remote regions with no means of subsistence. They were accused of collaborating with the Nazis, often with no evidence. The Soviet authorities welcomed the opportunity to break up communities with strong ethnic identities, and at the same time move settlers into the immense uninhabited desert regions. After Stalin's death, the authorities officially exonerated them of any crime after. Yeah. Well, Stalin was crazy. I don't say that. So yeah. And what is it that I wanted to say? Let's just go back to the actual video, cause yeah. And here, and here, and there you go.
They were separate. And then that allowed Hitler and the Nazi Party to have their own private military force that was not under the control of the army. So in other words, the army had a problem, because if the army ever did try to stand up to Hitler, it had this crazy fanatic force on the side. There's at least 2 people in the room right now who are going, oh my God, my country has this right freaking now. Anyway. So, the SS, there's about 800, 900 SS in Warsaw. Their goal is they're underneath the command of the commander, who's going to control the ghetto and take it out. In addition, the Nazis had about 1,100 auxiliary forces. So some of those were Travniki. So what the Travniki was Freiwillige Hilfsdienst, I think was their crazy name. They were volunteer helper servants or service. They were from the nations that got conquered by the Nazis, and then the Nazis went and recruited and said, hey, you're from the conquered nation that we think is subhuman. You want to fight for us? It's not a question. And then they would put them through a training course. So the Travniki there was a huge population of Ukrainians, some Poles. They were jammed into this force, and they're there. The Polish police were there, and they were literally what that is, the Polish police. There were Gestapo as well. The Gestapo were the secret police, the German secret police. So Germany today has like the most anti-state spying laws on the planet, because they never want to have another Gestapo. They are completely paranoid by the possibility that at some point something like that could have formed in Germany again. And that's the force that they're going to go into the ghetto with. They arrive on January 18, and the ZZW and the ZOB fight. And the Germans are stunned, right? They're like, wait, what are you doing? We're just here to round you up and take you to the colony out east. And the Jewish resistance goes, screw you, and they fight. The fighting lasts throughout the day. Multiple Germans were killed. I want to say it was like 12. It's not a huge number by any means. And then, a couple hundred of the Jewish resistance are killed. The Nazis were aiming to round up about 8,000 Jews from the ghetto that day. They ended up rounding up about 5,000, but then were in a state of shock because they couldn't believe that this had happened. How are they fighting back? Why are they fighting back? Where did this come from? It just completely took them off guard. The guy that was in charge of this was a guy named Saman Frankenegg. He had a hyphenated last name. He will eventually get replaced by another guy named Stroop. So Stroop comes into command. I want to say it was April 20th. So Saman Frankenegg is actually the guy who launches the next round of attacks. That happens April 19th. It took the Nazis the rest of February and into March and then April. It took them 2 months to wrap their mind around what had just happened and decide that they were ready to move again. They went in with vehicles and soldiers. Their goal is to round up the remainder of the ghetto. It was probably down to about 50,000 people, and finish it off. And they ran directly into Jewish resistance. The Jewish resistance fighters, whether they were the ZZW or the ZOP, did all sorts of crazy heroics. First of all, they had dug tunnels. There were multiple tunnels. I think there were 4 big tunnels that stretched from inside the ghetto to outside the ghetto so that they could work with the home guard and possibly even get equipment, food into the ghetto, right? They were bringing in supplies. They were just walled off. And so the only way to get stuff in and out was through these tunnels that they had built. They also used the sewer system. So these are European-style sewers. They're human height. You can literally walk through them. So they were also walking through the sewers underneath the city. And so between the tunnel system and the sewer system, they had this whole giant underground system, basically fortress. And they put whatever arms and ammunition they had in there, food supplies in there, so that they could operate freely, and they just pop up. They could pop up through manholes. European sewers hooked into people's basements, so you could come out through a basement. It was intense. On top of this, they built trenches where it was, there was a place to put a trench. They could connect the trenches through basements, so that you're not completely on the surface as you're moving through the city. They built fortified holdouts, multiple fortified holdouts. They had completely prepared as best as they could for when the Germans arrived to fight. And their goal was to fight to the death, because that's all there is. They know that if the Nazis take them to Treblinka, they die anyway. They might as well die here fighting to the death. And the Germans can't believe the level of resistance. In fact, in the fighting, they managed to set an armored car on fire, a German armored car on fire, I'm assuming with Molotov cocktails. And they got a German vehicle. The Germans had captured a bunch of French equipment. And they were these Lorraine chassis. They were basically tractors that the French were using to move equipment around for warfare purposes. And the Germans mounted stuff on top of them, like, for example, the Marder. They just basically stuck a gun on the top of this thing, and they had a self-propelled gun. I don't know what Lorraine vehicle that the Germans had there. I'm assuming it's a Marder, so it was probably just basically a fighting vehicle with a gun on the top. It's not a tank, right? Tank, the crew is protected. The guys are outside loading the stupid thing. In any case, whatever the vehicle was, it ends up on fire. So when the new guy, Stroop, takes over, he decides to take the vehicles out of the fighting. He decides that this kind of vehicle fighting in close quarters in a ghetto like this with all these traps laid out, you're just setting the vehicles on fire needlessly. But he also isn't going to show any mercy. He goes in full force. Day after day after day. They're bringing artillery. They're firing into the city. They had anti-aircraft guns that they had brought up. They were firing the anti-aircraft guns into the city. They had howitzers. They had infantry guns that they're firing in. Mortar rounds are going in. And then the Germans were equipped with demolition charges and flamethrowers. So they would just walk into a space. They'd throw the demolition charge, blow it up. They'd come in with the flamethrowers. They're burning the people out. People were hiding in basements. Right, because you got to remember, this is civilians mixed with soldiers. There's about 1,000 Jewish resistance soldiers, but there's about 50,000 Jewish civilians around them. And the Germans are trying to round up and take away the civilians, and the soldiers are trying to fight for the civilians. And so it's this mix, and they're going from building to building, from room to room. The Polish Home Guard jumps in, and they actually attack the Nazis from multiple positions outside of the ghetto. And actually, some of the Jewish resistance fighters went through the tunnels and came out and were attacking the Nazis in these outside positions. Like, the level of heroics and the level of coordination, considering how little they had and what they were fighting against, was insane. As the fighting went on, the ghetto starts to burn. Because between the flamethrowers and the artillery shells, stuff keeps getting caught on fire. And eventually the Nazis settle on, this is the way to do this. We'll just flatten the place. We'll just keep setting things on fire. We'll keep demolishing these buildings. We'll bring the rubble down on their heads. We'll kill them that way, in addition to shooting them and fighting them. And so this is how it goes right up until for about 10 days. By about April 29, the ZZW is done. Its commanders are all dead. I think to the last, like they're just finished. I think one of them escaped but got captured later. Maybe it wasn't 100% dead, but the commanders are mostly dead, and most of the soldiers are dead at that point. And so the remainder of the ZZW actually got into the into the tunnels and escaped. And they went to go join the Polish resistance. They figured, you know, we can just keep fighting. There's no point in dying here. The ZOB stays. They're gonna fight to the end. They're gonna die. And they continue to put up a resistance. But after April 29, there isn't much left. The ghetto's on fire. People are literally suffocating from the smoke. People are buried in the rubble. There's rotting corpses everywhere. It's a complete hell landscape. In the midst of all of this, even though they're hopeless, they're still holding out. They're fighting in basements. The Nazis are stuck building the building, even though the majority of the fighting is over by April 29. So April 30, they're still building the building. Finally, the Nazis get a break on May 8. The address is Mila 18. That was the street. The street was Mila. The street number was 18. That was the building that the ZOB had super fortified. They had done everything they could inside to just make it so that there was no way to capture the building. They had everything they could have for one last stand. As the Nazis began to attack the building and it became clear there was no escape and they were not going to win, they mass suicided inside Mila 18. The commander of the ZOB was a guy named Mordecai Anilovitz. If you look at a picture of I challenge you to look him up. Mordecai Anilovitz. His nickname was the Angel. You look at his face, he looks angelic. It was the perfect nickname for that guy. He looks like an angel. That guy was the mastermind behind the ZOB that put up this incredible fight, and then he does end up killing himself on May 8. There's actually 8 more days of fighting. By the time the fighting is done, the Nazis killed or captured 56,000 Jews. 13,000 dead, 43,000 captured. The estimate is that of the 13,000 that died, probably right about 6,500 actually died from suffocation or rubble collapsing on them. Obviously, there was also no water. There was no food, right? So there were other things that could have helped contribute to that 6,500. But suffocation, burning to death, and buildings collapsing on you is probably the bulk of it. The remaining 43,000, of course, were sent to Treblinka. And actually, some of them ended up in other places, like some of them ended up in concentration camps or other death camps. What ended up happening was there ended up being multiple more resistance events, for example, at Treblinka, and we believe that it was the survivors of the ghetto that were sent there who actually organized the uprising at Treblinka. So it was actually, turns out, a mistake to send them there because they end up having to replace Treblinka because the Nazis weren't one to want the world to completely know what was happening. We did, but we were really good at just going, you know, I don't see what's happening. On April, actually, I don't know if that's the...
Alright, I'll stop here again. And we're gonna continue that in 2 weeks' time. I'll be continuing now, but I will be last part now after 2 weeks. And so far, it's just like I remember from history as well. They were fighting, except the fact that the ZW... I'm trying to think now about that, but I'm pretty sure I never heard about it before. So yeah, I'm learning something new as well. And yeah, so you are gonna see what's the last part of this in 2 weeks' time, and you can always come and visit me tomorrow with a new video tomorrow. So thank you, and I see you tomorrow. Bye.